quiet.
Mr. President-elect,
Go ahead.
can you state
She's asking
categorically,
a question. Don't
Mr.
be
President-elect, can you give us a question?
Don't be
You're
rude.
attacking us. Can you give us a question?
Don't be rude. No, I'm not going to give you a
question?
question. I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you state categorically?
You are fake news.
Sir.
I'm Dr. Dave Janda. Welcome back to Dave versus the MSM. I'd like to thank you for joining me today. And our goal is for you to network this information to anyone and everyone you know and love, because the more people that are educated with the facts, the truth, the data, and when needed, the science, well, the more people that become empowered, and the sooner we end this decades-long reign of terror that's purposeful. It's not accidental. It's not coincidental. It's not because of incompetence. It's willful. The cult, in a nutshell, is a bunch of psychopaths that can't take the truth, which is actually what this video is based upon. About speaking the truth equals being a dissident to the cult. Let's start our segment off today with a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, author of the Gulag Archipelago, branded a dissident back in the old Soviet Union, which it's kind of looking around the West like everybody's the new Soviet Union, doesn't it? Here's what he said, quote, "In keeping silent about evil, in burying it so deep within us that no sign of it appears on the surface, we are implanting it, and it will rise up 1,000-fold in the future. When we neither punish nor reproach evildoers, we are not simply protecting their trivial old age. We are thereby ripping the foundations of justice from beneath new generations." End quote. And very true. So the news this week was that a dissident by the name of Alexei Navalny, who was imprisoned in an Arctic prison by Putin, has died in jail. And this has led a number of the cult puppets to say, this surely doesn't happen here in the United States or in the West. Oh, no. Really? Why don't you ask Julian Assange about that? Why don't you ask these people that are in a DC gulag since January of 2021? Why don't you ask anyone who's been targeted by the two-tiered justice system? You know, no just us system. No justice. No prosecution as long as you're a member of the cult. But, if you're a dissident, if you speak out for freedom, for liberty, well, you are going to have the iron hand of the totalitarian regime's justice system thrust upon you. And it's not just Trump. There are thousands of people. Or you might be victimized, targeted by one of their agencies, like the good old, tax agency. Yeah. So this death in this Russian prison, and any death, is abhorrent and should be dissected of what happened and why it happened, and the responsible parties be held accountable. According to Il Demente, who wanders around aimlessly in, I guess, the Oval Office, this is reason to pass another $60 billion in funding for Ukraine. This might even be a reason to go to war. So, from Zero Hedge, Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny died in a maximum security prison in the country's far north. The Interfax News Service recently reported, citing the Federal Penitentiary Service in Russia. 47-year-old Navalny, a major critic of President Vladimir Putin, vanished in December of 2023 from a prison in the Vladimir region where he was serving a 3-decade term from extremism and fraud charges that he had called political payback for his anti-Kremlin stance a decade ago. He had no expectations of getting out of jail as long as Putin was in power. He later emerged in a remote Arctic prison camp, ending nearly 3 weeks in which his whereabouts were unknown. Navalny's death leaves any opposition to Putin in question. All of Putin's top adversaries are now either deceased in prison or living in exile. That's a cult member's dream, isn't it? Yeah. Navalny was undoubtedly the biggest thorn in the Kremlin side. For over a decade, he led nationwide protests against the authorities, ran for office to challenge members of the Russian establishment, and set up a network of campaign offices across the country that have since been dismantled. So when you hear that, you think, wow, this dissident on his own took on Big Brother, right? Big Brother being Putin and the Kremlin and the like. Well, you know, things are not always so black and white, right? So you do a little work, research on this. Navalny was tied to intelligence agencies, several of them. And there are videos of him requesting multi-millions of dollars in funding for his opposition, for payment of his opposition. So, in a way, the powers that be in Russia saw this guy as a spy, an agent, because he was being paid by foreign intelligence services. I'm not saying that that's reason to persecute somebody. What I am saying is there is a bit of another side to this story with Navalny. But the people that are saying we should use this to go to war, we should use this death to further strap the taxpayers in the United States and send 60 billion more to Ukraine. How Ukraine is related to Navalny, I don't know. Only El Demente can try to, right, in his warped mind. But, you know, before they're throwing these rocks from their crystal palaces, they better look at their own operations. Because being a dissident in Russia is not much different than being labeled a dissident in the West. And they want to send all this money to Ukraine. Well, wait a minute. A U.S. citizen, and we've talked about this before, but it bears repeating, a U.S. citizen who's a journalist was put in prison in Ukraine for speaking against their government and is now dead. His name is Gonzalo Lira. Media is freaking out over a Russian leader being killed in a Russian prison, but didn't say much when an American journalist was arrested and killed by Zelensky's regime in Ukraine. I repeat, an American journalist was arrested and killed by the Zelensky regime in Ukraine. Gonzalo Lira is his name. But it's not just in these far-off lands where people are being persecuted. Sean Davis, independent journalist, wrote the following. Because all we have to do is look around. Whether it's those that are being detained for extremely long periods of time in a DC gulag for peacefully protesting in January of 2021, to the point where a number of these people who have been persecuted actually committed suicide, essentially put to death by the government because of the coercion and the oppression. These cats in the crystal palaces in the West shouldn't even be throwing a pebble, let alone a stone, let alone a boulder. Sean Davis. The American government would never imprison an individual whose life and knowledge suddenly became a huge liability to the regime. Like, what about Julian Assange? How does he work in all this? Yeah. And it would definitely never kill him in prison, wipe the video cameras that recorded his death. Oh. and then claim he committed suicide. Good old Jeff. Yeah. And the American government would certainly never try to ban its chief political opponent from the ballot, try to bankrupt him with frivolous lawsuits, or attempt to imprison him to prevent him from winning an election. The American government would never influence investigators appointed by the president's hand-picked lawyers to absolve that same president of a whole host of crimes committed by the president and his family. On top of that, the American government would never imprison thousands of political dissidents for protesting against the regime's history of potentially altering elections, or refer to them as a bunch of filthy wrecker insurrectionists. And you better believe the American government would never ally with corrupt oligarchs who owe their fortunes to monopolies protected by the government to censor the government's political opponents to prevent them from talking about the corruption of the family running the government. Oh, yeah, no. That would never happen in America. That only happens in other countries. America's government would never, ever do anything, let alone think about doing anything like that. Sean's right. When you speak the truth and facts and data and when needed science, you are a dissident, no matter what country you're in. Because when you do all that, when you speak the truth, you are taking on the very viability of the globalist cult and their puppets. Solzhenitsyn was right. Because if we remain silent and we don't bring this information forward when we have available at the precise minute, it allows the psychopaths to get more power, control, and more financial resources, which will only be used by these psychopaths to cause more chaos, more conflict, more death, and more destruction. Speaking truth is difficult because of the ramifications from the cult. But it's needed not just by a few of us, but by all of us. You see, they might try to act like they're all powerful, this cult. But when it comes down to it, there's several thousand of them. Just in the United States, there's 320 million of us. Around the world, there are billions of us. But they don't want you to know that. That we have them drastically outnumbered. Right. The single most effective thing you can do, because many people say, you know, geez, I realize there's a problem, but there's nothing I can do. Yeah, there is. Speak up. Speak out. Help others. Because that's what you do when you speak up and speak out. And encourage them to do the same. Because when that happens, and it is happening, but we need a little more. It's what the cult ultimately fears. Because when that happens, they're done. Done. D-O-N-E. Done. I thank you for joining me today. We are available 24/7 at davejanda.com. We have a tremendous amount of free public information there, but where the real meat, the in-depth content that I cannot go into on any social media platform or on the radio. Why? Because of the choke points. And there's also an overarching umbrella of censorship. We pointed it out for many years. At the behest of, who else? the government. Which is why DaveJanda.com is so important. It's uncensored and it's protected. We have the best IT team on the planet, and we put a huge amount of money every month into that platform being safe and secure. I go into content there that puts you years, in some cases over a decade, ahead of the curve, which is why the cult despises what I do and how I do it. But people who value freedom and value liberty and value their own future embrace what we do. Join us. You will not be sorry. You will be empowered. That is what the cult does not want. But I hope it's what you want. Until next time, Dave Janda signing off. Dream big and dare to fail. Thanks for your time today.